Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, Sophia, dear colleagues, it is a true joy to be together as we approach the celebration of the Nativity of our Lord Jesus Christ. And unlike Sophia mentioned, I think the DSA actually has everything to do with Christmas, and I'll explain why. While the Digital Services Act may not seem as a festive topic, it is in fact a very fitting one. Freedom of expression is what allows us to celebrate our faith publicly, to speak openly, to greet one another freely, and to live without fear of expressing our convictions. Freedom of expression should not be an abstract luxury because it underpins democratic self-government, scientific inquiry, religious freedom, and progress. Today, online platforms have become the primary public square. Political debate, journalism, academic discussion, religious expression, satire, and protest all take place there. The key question is not whether genuinely criminal content, such as terrorism or child exploitation, should be addressed. There is broad agreement that it should. The real question is how far regulation goes beyond that and whether laws like the DSA end up doing more harm than good. There is a popular meme that captures the spirit of our time. What is it like living in the UK, but you can put it whenever you want to put it, wherever there is a law like that? A person says, I can't complain, that's good. No, I mean, I can't complain, I can get arrested. Now, you might think this is an over-exaggeration, but in what follows, I would want to give you a couple of examples to argue for this thesis. Political, philosophical, and religious dissent is increasingly cornered, criminalized, and suppressed online. And let me give you 3 examples. Last year, a Belgian civic group sought to launch an online campaign during the Christmas season under the slogan, "Put Christ back in Christmas." Its aim was simple, to affirm the Christian origins of Christmas and encourage public recognition of Christianity's cultural and historical role in the Belgian society. The group involved Catholic priests who gave online sermons and ran coordinated awareness campaigns, including sponsored messaging and digital ads. The campaign was ultimately not authorized. Belgian authorities concluded that the message was exclusionary and not respectful of other beliefs, therefore unsuitable for public dissemination. As a result, the group was barred from running the campaign online through approved public and digital channels. Secondly, in Latvia, the Coalition for the Protection of Children and the Family launched an online campaign advocating for the right of children to know their mother and the father and to be protected from exposure to comprehensive sexuality education. They pursued this aim democratically by collecting signatures to amend Latvia's constitution. The campaign operated mainly through a Facebook page, sharing legal explanations, policy arguments, and calls for civic participation. Within months, the initiative gathered close to 1 million signatures. Shortly before the collection phase concluded, Facebook closed the page without prior notice. The administrators received a generic notification stating that the campaign violated policies related to harmful content. No specific post was identified, and no appeal was successful in restoring this campaign. Finally, during the previous mandate of the European Parliament, a French member of the European Parliament, Jean-Pierre Pascal, delivered a speech criticizing what he described as the EU's pro-abortion policies, warning that they promoted a culture of death. The speech was delivered in Parliament, it was recorded, it was uploaded to the Parliament's internal digital systems, as is the standard practice. Shortly afterwards, the recording disappeared. Officials later indicated that it had been removed because trusted flaggers identified it as being hateful and asked to be removed. Now, let me turn to you. How many people in this room have heard of at least one of these cases? Please raise your hands and do not be shy. On the one hand, I'm a bit worried that you have heard about these cases because they've never happened. On the other hand, I think the people that show their hands are actually indicating a specific change in our culture. The fact that we think that such cases can actually happen, and the fact that we are in agreement that they actually can happen legally. The point is that they could happen, and under the DSA they could happen quietly, as you may never heard about them at all. Speech under the banner of loosely defined illegal content or under the new buzz terms of hate speech, harmful content, abuse of information, disinformation, misinformation, may disappear in the online clouds immediately after the speech was posted by the buttons pressed by platforms, administrators, trusted flaggers, or regulators operating under vague and expansive moderation frameworks. So the risk is not that lawful speech will be restricted. It is that too, but it is that it may never reach us in the first place. The sermons that we will not be able to hear, the civic campaigns that will not be able to launch online, the parents who never manage to speak out in despair and outrage online when their children are ideologically targeted. This is why the question of free speech and the DSA is so timely. The DSA affects everyone who uses the internet, which today means everyone. This is not a technical debate about platform regulation. It is about who decides what may be seen, shared, said in the digital public square and under what safeguards. So what is the DSA? The DSA is a binding EU regulation, that means a legally binding EU law, which gives the European Commission power to enforce content moderation on very large online platforms and digital services, that means more than 45 million users per month, established in or offering their services in the EU. Most of its provisions came into force in February of 2024. Platforms that fail to comply with limitations of speech orders face massive financial penalties and even suspension. Individuals can suffer censorship and suspension from online platforms. And at the heart of the DSA lies its most dangerous flaw, which is the definition of illegal content. Article 3H of the DSA defines illegal content as anything that is not in compliance with EU law or any law of any member state of the European Union now or at any point in the future. This loose and circular definition will trigger a lowest common denominator where the most speech restrictive laws nationally in the European Union might be used to limit expression in the whole EU and potentially in the world. Let's look in Germany, where it is illegal to insult a politician. If a content creator in the US posts a video, a satire, or a cartoon of a politician on X, Meta, or TikTok, that content may be taken down as illegal not only in Germany, which is the case now, but through strategic litigation in the whole EU and potentially everywhere in the world. And this is not in accordance with international and European human rights laws, which require limitations on fundamental rights to be precise, foreseeable, and necessary in a democratic society. Otherwise, we need to know as regular citizens when we're acting within the confines of the law, when we're law-abiding citizens or law-breaching citizens. The Digital Services Act was presented as a modernization of the old e-commerce directive, which is a technical market regulation designed to harmonize rules and reduce fragmentation. But it did not remain technical. It evolved, or dare I say, it revealed its true colors, a framework for speech control online. Rather than narrowly defining illegal content and leaving determinations to courts, the DSA delegates the identification, prioritization, and removal of speech to private platforms under the threat of massive sanctions. Now, you might say formally the Commission does not censor speech, and it's true. But functionally, it has designed a system in which speech decisions are made in the constant shadow of regulatory punishment. Let us unfold this now. A crucial mechanism of the DSA is what it calls systemic risk assessment and mitigation, Articles 34 to 36. Under Article 34 and 35, very large platforms are required not only to address illegal content that we've unfolded before, but to assess whether their services create, I quote, negative effects on civic discourse, electoral processes, public health, gender-based considerations, actual or foreseeable. So let that sink in, actual or foreseeable. And this is where the problem begins. First, civic discourse risk is not a legal category with clear legal boundaries. It is an elastic concept. A campaign affirming the Christian meaning of Christmas can be framed as exclusionary now or in the future, actual or foreseeable. A parental movement defending the right of a child to know both their mother and the father can be framed as harmful to minors or involving so-called gender-based violence towards same-sex couples, now or in the future, actual or foreseeable. A parliamentary speech criticizing abortion policy can be framed as hate speech. The net is cast wide, wide, wide. And these acts can either be labeled as illegal content, or even when they are not, they may still be classified as systemic risks to civil discourse. So the finish line is the same. The conclusion is pre-written, and such speech needs to be delegated, deleted, or mitigated. Deletion is clear, but what does mitigation of risk actually means in practice? Mitigation is not neutral. It explicitly includes altering algorithms, accelerating removals, downranking content, or disabling accounts. Faced with the threat of fines of up to 6% of the global turnover, platforms have every incentive to err on the side of removal. They have actually no punishment for over-removal. The rational response is not to protect speech, but to suppress it early and quietly. And now let us move on to the so-called trusted flaggers. Under the DSA, trusted flaggers are NGOs or entities granted privileged status to report content to platforms. They're essentially trusted by the member states and mostly in opposition to platforms and sometimes even to users themselves. Such NGOs get significant funding in order to scan the internet for potentially illegal content or risky or harmful content. Then they flag that to the platforms, which need to prioritize the requests made by so-called trusted flaggers. Their notices are fast-tracked, prioritized, and often acted on without meaningful scrutiny. The danger here is simple. They are not neutral. These actors are selected, certified, and often funded by national authorities, yet they exercise enormous influence over what stays online without judicial oversight. This creates a two-tier system of speech. Content flagged by trusted actors is presumed problematic, while ordinary user speech is treated as a risk to be managed. In practice, this incentivizes platforms to remove lawful but controversial speech to avoid regulatory trouble, especially on religion, morality, and dissenting political views. Trusted flaggers shift censorship from courts to private actors, from law to policy, and from accountability to discretion. And that is not a safeguard for democracy. It's a shortcut around free speech protections. So let us sink this in. Platforms conduct systemic risk assessments. Algorithms are adjusted, content is quietly removed or downranked. Platforms' fines are going up to 6% of global annual turnover for non-compliance. There is no comparable penalty, even no penalty at all for over-censorship. So the rational response is obvious. When in doubt, take it down. And finally, Article 36 introduces crisis powers, allowing the Commission to demand heightened moderation during vaguely defined emergencies. At exactly the moments when society's most needs open debate during crisis, the threshold for intervention becomes even lower. We have seen that unfolding during the COVID-19 crisis, when speech was limited under the pretext that it amounted to misinformation, disinformation, or threats to public safety. However, yesterday's misinformation has become today's proven fact or medical truth. Let's move on to enforcement. Now, I know this slide is difficult to read because of the colors, but just bear this in mind that the enforcement regime is exceptionally heavy. Regulators can investigate, issue binding orders, impose fines, and ultimately restrict platform access. Because the DSA is global in scope and extraterritorial in nature, it is not limited to isolated national systems, such as in Austria or Germany, but it affects the whole world. This is why, apart from the national digital service coordinators, and this is the scheme actually that the European Commission put on its website, trusted flaggers come in, national regulators and monitoring reporters. There is also an EU board for digital services. Digital service coordinators coordinate among themselves to make sure that the requests are mainstream. But what this means in practice is that the same content might be flagged under 27 different jurisdictions and under shifting legal definitions. Platforms themselves can be required to produce reports catered to such jurisdictions, triggering an immense bureaucracy of reporting and annual audits. But you might wonder, why does this matter for free speech? If it becomes a burden on companies, why should we care? It's simple. Because platforms are businesses, and businesses want simple, straightforward rules that are cost-effective. The bureaucracy is already pushing the big platforms to disfavor geo-blocking of content, meaning the reduction of that content in one specific jurisdiction, say Germany or Austria, and rather go to global blocking among various jurisdictions because it is the safest and most cost-effective solution for them, from geo-blocking to global blocking. And what is at stake is our speech online. Turning to the European Commission, their powers are actually enormous, despite the public claims that the Commission is just a neutral player and a mere observer. Such powers include setting up the rules, creating layers after layers of long hands of censorship through digital service coordinators, deputizing limitations on speech to trusted flaggers and researchers, watching out for DSA implementation, launching infringement proceedings against member states for failing to implement the DSA, and sanctioning platforms up to 6% of global turnover for not censoring enough. And this is just to mention a few. And the DSA does not operate alone. Voluntary codes of conduct on hate speech and disinformation, never adopted through normal legislative processes, are increasingly treated as compliance benchmarks. Here is a trajectory of how the DSA came about and what has come immediately after it. In 2016, the EU Code of Conduct on Countering Illegal Hate Speech Online, which was consolidated now as the Plus Code of Conduct in January 2025, it requires platforms to rapidly remove labeled content as illegal hate speech, relying on vague national laws and trusted flaggers rather than judicial determinations. We move on to the Code of Practice on Disinformation, adopted in 2018, strengthened in 2022, and integrated in the DSA this year. It pushes platforms to demonetize, downrank, label, or remove content deemed disinformation, especially concerning elections, public health, and geopolitics, through coordinated enforcement and rapid response mechanisms. Article 35 guidelines on electoral integrity, issued in April 2024, it instructs very large platforms to adapt algorithms, content moderation, and advertising systems during election to mitigate risks to civic discourse, incentivizing preemptive moderation of political speech. And here is a simpler graph also showing the acts following the DSA. Post-DSA, there are additional instruments coming in to fill in the gaps of the DSA or to multiply EU obligations, deepening speech control in the hands of the EU censorship industrial complex. European Media Freedom Act, its impact on speech is clear. It facilitates the funding of EU-approved media and narratives while pushing dissenting media into the category of rogue media, eroding its reputation and putting significant barriers to funding. So if some of you here in the room are actually working for an alternative media, you might find yourself falling within the category of rogue media with high reputational risks. Then the Child Sexual Abuse Regulation, or the Chat Control File. Recently, the Council agreed on a proposal, it was just a couple of weeks ago, which enables the so-called voluntary scanning of private communications of everyone in this room, age verification, blocking and delisting orders, undermining confidentiality, anonymity, and lawful expression under the guise of child protection. And I'm sure we'll go more in depth in the questions and answers. That European Democracy Shield creates coordinated EU-level mechanisms to counter foreign information manipulation with broad definition, crisis protocols, fact-checking infrastructures that risks suppressing lawful political speech. And last but not least, the Digital Fitness Act, which represents a shift, it is just a proposal for now, from regulating platforms to shaping user behavior, framing certain viewpoints or engagement patterns as unhealthy or harmful. So it is legitimate to ask, is the DSA the tool to allow us to be in control of what we see online, as the European Commission posted only this weekend in a campaign pro-DSA? Or is it a tool for elites to be in control, as they have the power to define hate speech, misinformation, and disinformation? But I call on you that this is not a reason for resignation. It is a reason for resolve. The DSA is not just another regulation. It has become the foundation upon which so many other regulatory initiatives are built. It is the symbolic battleground for the future of free speech. The DSA is the keystone. Challenge it successfully, and the logic of everything built upon it is weakened. Every new code, guideline, and shield depend on it. And that makes the DSA the decisive fight. And history tells us something else. Censorship does not collapse because it is modest. It collapses because it grows. Like the Hydra, each new head makes the creature larger, heavier, and impossible to ignore. Overreach exposes itself. The more speech is managed, the clearer the cost becomes. To democracy, to trust, and to freedom itself. That visibility is not a weakness for free speech. It is paradoxically an advantage. And it is why this fight is not only necessary, but winnable. So what have we done as ADF International about the DSA? Because censorship today operates across borders, it can only be effective challenged through a coordinated international response. And this is precisely where our work matters most. As a global organization with a presence in London, Brussels, and Washington, D.C., and with strong influence in Ireland and across Europe, we're uniquely positioned to address the DSA, and not rhetorically, but practically. Our ultimate objective is clear: to reform or annul the DSA so that freedom of speech is protected in the digital space. And to achieve that, we have focused on several defining priorities. Engaging decisively in the November 2025 DSA review, preparing and pursuing strategic litigation, including an action for annulment before the Court of Justice of the European Union, sustained international advocacy from EU institutions to the United Nations, the US State Department, and US Congress, direct engagement with digital platforms, and increasing public and media scrutiny of the DSA's real-world effects. Let me highlight just a few milestones. We therefore stepped into this calling and consolidated our role as conveners and experts. And this work has already produced a number of firsts for us as an organization. The first ever European Parliament event on the DSA in May of this year, which we organized together with members of European Parliament and which set the tone for subsequent debates. Featuring as expert speaker at the United Nations Human Rights Expert Workshop on Disinformation organized by the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. Testifying before the US Congress on Europe's threat to American speech and innovation. Our UK-based colleague Lorcan Price did an outstanding job, and the testimony generated global attention. Addressing the United Nations General Assembly with our DC-based colleague Kelsey Zorzi, speaking recently on so-called Free Speech Under Fire event at UN during High-Level Week, complementing our UN team's formal complaint regarding the DSA to the UN special procedures. And speaking at the Web Summit, which is Europe's largest tech conference with 90,000 attendees, this put this work firmly on the global tech radar. And to understand the reach of this event and also perhaps to break into the technicality of this event and this discussion, let's watch a very short video from the night of the opening of the Web Summit.
Wow. Lisbon, good evening. This is our 10th year in Portugal. You're very, very welcome.
I hope that gave you at least a bit of a snapshot of the immense number of people who are attending this event. And we were truly honored to be there and present our legal work on the DSA and to be with colleagues representing our organization. So the legitimate question now is, where do we go from here? We need to join forces to rebuild a culture of free speech. The European Commission was scheduled to review the DSA in November of 2025, and despite free speech concerns being voiced by the US administration, Congress, the US ambassador to the EU, 50+ European free speech NGOs, and more than 100 free speech experts in a letter coordinated by ADF International, the European Commission has not addressed freedom of expression in its review report, saying that it would address it in the next review in 2027. That's very ironic because free speech has been the major concern regarding this regulation. and the European Commission failed to step into a responsible place where to engage with such concerns. This needs to be made public, and the European Commission should be asked why it decided not to address free speech concerns, despite them being the most prominent concerns raised in relation to the DSA. We have a public campaign and a letter which you can still sign online, so please make sure to check our landing page or to scan the business cards that you can find here at the entrance. You can connect with your government representatives and brief them on the DSA and subsequent censorial attempts of the EU, such as chat control, the European Democracy Shield, the European Media Freedom Act, and please reach out to us as we have other briefings on all of these matters. Another recommendation would be to organize roundtables and parliamentary or governmental events to raise awareness of the DSA and its lack of compatibility with freedom of expression. Be on the lookout for national litigation and inform us of cases involving free speech online. There is alarming censorship happening online, but there is little reporting of cases. We have been standing firmly to support those silenced and targeted for their faith offline, and we're ready and we're indeed doing so online as well. But we need your support for timely identification of cases, especially the national ones, and quick legal support, because this is a sustained, strategic, and effective work, and it is far from over. So, as we approach Christmas, we're reminded that the Christian message entered the world not through power or coercion, but among other things through speech, through proclamation, witness, and truth spoken freely. Today, however, the danger to free expression is not only open censorship, but quiet disappearance. Ideas that never reach the public square, debates that never happen, voices filtered out before we even know they exist. A society that fears words has already lost confidence in itself. If we accept a model in which speech is permitted only when it is safe, approved, and managed, we accept a democracy in retreat. Speech should not be considered a risk to be mitigated, but the foundation of our democracies. If we wish to preserve both our democratic and spiritual inheritance, we must defend the freedom to speak, to disagree, and to proclaim what we believe online as much as offline. Thank you for your attention.
Welcome back, everyone. And thank you, Adina, for that fantastic outline and presentation. I have a few questions for you now, and then everyone else be thinking of any questions that you might like to ask, and we'll have an open discussion after this. And then we can continue the discussion, enjoy the rest of the evening. Adina, I wanted to start thinking of this concept of coming out of communism, and we're friends, of course, with Rod Dreher, who wrote his great book, Live Not by Lies, and really detailed what it was like to live under a regime where freedom of expression was so effectively squashed. And the picture that Rod and many others have painted during that time is that people living under it, they didn't know what they didn't know. It wasn't that they knew that they were being censored, but because of the censorship, they didn't know the extent of it. And of course, they didn't see it actively happening. There was no means of challenging it. And over a period of time, you just get used to accepting that what you are receiving is very curated information, curated news. And so I start with this question, just thinking about life in the digital age, and life under a regime like the DSA. I think my question is, to what extent are we at risk of that today? To what extent do we not know what we don't know? With shadow bans, with AI and its impact on algorithms, with downranking, with this web of trusted flaggers and this huge machinery in the background that none of us tap into and see. To what extent are we already living under a system in which the information we're receiving digitally is coming through a huge filter?
Yeah, absolutely. We're living in a world where there is a lot of curated speech, and it is, as you say, impossible to know what is out there. As I mentioned, the campaigns that might be there, the alliances that we might forge, had we know, if there is a space in Latvia or Lithuania, the civic engagement that we might be able to have. And as you were speaking, I'm diverting a little bit because you mentioned communism, and I was very small when communism fell in Romania. Was not even 4. Now I disclose my age, but that's not an issue. But I do have one distinctive memory of that. I remember I was watching TV back at home with my grandmother, as it used to be the case that children used to stay with their grandparents when they were very small. And I remember seeing Ceausescu on TV, and I made the remark, "This is a very silly man." Now, obviously, I must have heard it in the house somewhere, but I will never forget the look of my grandmother, the shock in her eyes, looking and saying, "Never shall you say that again." And as you were mentioning communism, my thought went to that because what I was essentially doing at the age of 3 was to insult a politician. Now, he was the politician in the country. He was a dictator, of course, but already in my household, there was this fear, this terror that you should not speak your mind, right? And what we see now is you translate that into the online sphere with all of these different rules and sensitivities and hate speech and misinformation, and you do not know whether that speech, perhaps a legitimate concern that I had as a child, the intuition that I had as a child, that concern may not reach the others. And that puts you in a silo, and that actually disengages you from a civic discourse. So, long answer short, but yes, there are loads of reasons for concern.
And okay, and so given that concern, here in, let's say, continental Europe, the EU obviously does a very good job in terms of its marketing. Everyone loves the EU. You love not queuing for passport control, love not having to exchange money across many borders, especially here in Austria with so many borders. And so it's hard to imagine, I think, for the average European, the idea that the European Union, this thing that has literally prevented us from World War III, it is acting in such a way that human rights lawyers such as ourselves would be criticizing it. And so I think that because of that, I want you to just unpack again for us as a European, as someone who has studied international human rights law and worked your entire career within this framework and setting, why, well, not why, but just emphasize again to us the extent to which the EU is not some neutral player in this regard, the upholder of all of our liberties, but is actively pushing a censorship regime. I want you to emphasize it because we will never read about it. We will never hear criticism. We will never be exposed to this sort of thing, but it's your education and it's your whole career, and you've lived and worked in Brussels, in the EU. So I want you to specifically speak to, from your lived experience, the EU is turning here into a censor, is it not?
We have to ask ourselves what the EU is, what it was founded upon, what it was designed to do, and where we are now. Because as you say, I've benefited from the EU, as many of you in this room. I've started studying in another country. I benefited from scholarships, some of which were under the European Union banner. I worked on EU-funded projects in Graz, not least, from the European Commission. I started then work in another country, in Belgium, where I am in a different system than my own. All of these different benefits that, as you say, people are not necessarily nostalgic, but they are grateful to the European Union. And I think there is reason to be grateful, and we should be honest and say that there are parts that the European Union gave to us and gave to me personally that I would not have allowed back in Romania. The education might have been to a different level or more costly. The opportunities would certainly be different. I wouldn't be working for ADF International in Romania because we do not have a Romanian office, and so on and so forth. So there is a sense of gratitude. And I think upon this sense of gratitude, there is a difficulty for each and every one of us to realize that the project has gone astray, and that instead of actually fostering these opportunities to people in need or to people that want to pursue education, people who want mobility across the countries, that want this very exciting intellectual community in getting together, we have ended up now in a space where the European Union, despite its lack of competence, is pushing countries to recognize same-sex marriage, to recognize abortion, even sometimes without any kind of limits up to birth. Euthanasia, even in Belgium, as I'm living, that euthanasia practice is being pushed as an ideology, not only to Belgians, but to the neighboring countries. And the difficulty as a lawyer is knowing that there is no legal basis for that. I was even discussing in the break of the recent Court of Justice of the European Union decision, Kupriak Trojan, where two Polish men went to Germany to get married as a homosexual couple and returned to Poland. There was no reason for them to ask for free movement, which was the argument that they invoked, because the European Union is a union of values. They need to have free movement, they need to return to Poland, and they need to be recognized as spouses. Now, Poland has a definition in their constitution of marriage between one man and one woman. That definition is at odds with what this couple is seeking, but also what the European Union has actually imposed on Poland and all member states. And if we look at the DSA was pushed in its incipient phase, which was 2016, the Code of Conduct on Hate Speech Online, because in 2016, Angela Merkel opened the borders in Germany and said, all you migrants come to Germany, all is fine. And then there were loads and loads of critical arguments online, and the people in power, especially the German side, realized that they have to push for narrative control, because otherwise the whole regime would have crumbled. And this is how the legal hate speech code of conduct came about, 2016, the one that was consolidated now in 2025, and it went into the DSA. So I just want us to reflect on that. On the one hand, the gratitude that we have for the European project after the two world wars, the benefits, the real benefits that it has given us, perhaps each and every one of us, but then also to recognize that there is a moral erosion of the project. And I would want us to reflect on whether we can turn that back or not.
Yeah, well, after the cameras are turned off, we can. No, thank you, Adina. That was a great answer, and I can almost hear in you the lament of seeing this firsthand sort of go in this direction. I want to talk about the intellectual dishonesty, because part of that relates in terms of how the DSA was marketed as recently really as the past week. So we organized this letter to the European Commission by over 100 free speech advocates around the world. Really great people signed on to this, and the European Commission wrote back to us a couple of weeks ago in response to our letter, and once again made the claim, which they also make publicly, that the DSA is content agnostic. That is to say, it is not about content regulation at all. Really doesn't mind. It's, that's not, we've misunderstood. The fact that it talks about illegal content 100 times in the DSA is irrelevant. It talks about misinformation, hate speech, and so forth. In the mind of the Commission, or at least how it's marketing this, it is content agnostic, and it's all about the platforms. They get to make the decision. So would you just, again, explain why that is really, in many ways, a dishonest framing of what the regulation is doing? Why is it not the platform choice, but behind the platform, the EU?
You cannot claim to be content agnostic or to push for a piece of legislation that admittedly is content agnostic, and then to ask platforms to do risk mitigation. If they do not do risk mitigation, you come in and say you haven't done enough, because you have a value judgment there to say you haven't done enough because there are civic dangers to the discourse, to the electoral processes, there are dangers to gender-based violence, and so on. So there is a judgment value behind all of that. Even when the European Commission comes and starts infringement procedures, they're saying you're not deleting enough. How is the European Commission aware that these companies are not deleting enough? By making a judgment, a claim, an assessment. So you cannot be content agnostic regarding that. Of course, the European Commission is playing more on that argument based on illegal content, saying that illegal content is indeed the definition that each member state provides. So it's not the European Commission coming and providing a new definition of illegal content in Germany or Austria or Romania and so on. And that, strictly speaking, is true, but it completely puts aside the fact that the European Commission is a player. It's a political player. They're putting pressure on countries to change definitions that then they can go after and say it's only the definition of Germany.
Right, right. So it's like me holding a gun to your head, but behind me is someone holding a gun to my head saying shoot, and then I'm not doing anything, but really there is the hand of the commission is behind every company, every trusted flagger, all of the national networks, all of the funding mechanisms, the fines, everything. And speaking of Germany and misogyny, and let's just talk about the transnational nature of this, because that's another point I wanted to draw out. So Ceausescu is a silly man. Let's say you tweeted that in Romania. Or you tweeted it here, for example, in Austria. Just one of you tweeted it this evening as a quote from Adina. And that, let's say, is lawful speech here in Austria. But let's say it's not in Romania. And someone sees that tweet from Romania, tweeted here tonight in Vienna, and reports it through the various different national networks. Then is it the case that even though that would be a perfectly legal thing to say here in Austria, if someone reports it in Romania, then through this mechanism, it could get taken down across the entire bloc?
Absolutely. So companies rely on the trusted flaggers to prioritize speech. So let's say there is a trusted flagger in Romania. They say this is a danger to civic discourse, or this is illegal content.
Undermines democracy.
Undermine democracy. We can think of all the different reasons why this can happen. So then the companies have to prioritize that speech. But by using that definition of either illegal content or risk to democracy, other flaggers in the whole of the European Union can ask for the deletion based on the Romanian definition, mind you, of illegal content. What that triggers is that the companies have to produce reports in all of these different jurisdictions where the trusted flaggers are reporting. If there are 10 jurisdictions, they will need to produce 10 different reports, and the audits that they do annually in those jurisdictions have to include that. Once again, what will the companies do? They will go from this geo-blocking in Romania, they delete the speech, to the global blocking, because it's much easier for them to say we've received the same kind of flagging in 10 different jurisdictions, even if it's based only on one member state's law in Romania. So we're going to delete it across. And the danger goes even further, that based on this definition, you can ask for the deletion worldwide. So somebody in the US sees that, right? You post that specific speech in Austria, it gets seen in Romania, but it also gets seen in the US based on a company that, of course, operates here in the European Union. It's important to mention this because the DSA regulates that. So even in the US, that content can disappear based on a remote definition or just an interpretation based in the Romanian legal system.
So because this has only been really in force for just over a year now, so that is nothing in terms of the complexity and size of the legislation, what we could reasonably imagine happening in the future is essentially lowest common denominator of censorship cropping up in various remote parts of Europe with very zealous, trusted flaggers and a very cleverly worked through system that are just consistently flagging content that orders takedowns across the whole of the EU and maybe the globe.
Absolutely. That will be for sure the case. And you're right in saying that it is still early days. Now, the provisions of the DSA entered into force in 2024. It is still quite early to see these cases in practice, but I'm sure they will unfold more and more. We have seen a number of instances by which the DSA is used to curate content for businesses, to silence politicians of dissenting political natures, especially in Germany. And we can easily think of the example that you gave with Ceausescu, but put it in the context of a pro-life campaign, of a pro-family campaign, a Babylon Bee meme or satire that criticizes or ridicules Ursula von der Leyen, and that's taken down in Germany and maybe everywhere, and it cannot be visible anymore in the US. And as you said, the most concerning part is we will not even know that this is being deleted. And here it is the mechanism of the DSA that goes so much into the sensorial aspect.
Okay. So let's keep with another tangible example. So I find when discussing the DSA, trying to keep it tangible and not lost in a web of algorithms and things that I barely understand. So keep it real and tangible and physical. Let's talk about a case we know, the case of Päivi Räsänen. Everyone in here, I think, is familiar. Finnish member of parliament being prosecuted for hate speech. But at the heart of her case is a tweet, so it very much is within the digital sphere. That tweet, by the way, is still available on X. It was never ordered to be taken down. It's been online lawfully for 6 years, according to the code of conduct of X and other social media platforms. And so that case is making its way through the courts. We hopefully receive a positive verdict from the Finnish Supreme Court early next year. But under a DSA framework, again, just trying to keep this very tangible, how could a situation like that, where it's still being litigated, it's not the case hasn't run its course yet, how could something like that fall within the web of the DSA potentially?
Yeah, so we're speaking about deletion of speech. It can be also a deprioritization of speech. We never know how visible a specific content that we put on is actually going to be, or what traction it's going to have. And I was thinking, as you mentioned, let's say Päivi actually gets to a verdict where it is said that that specific content is illegal.
In Finland.
In Finland. What will it happen under the DSA? Because in principle, if the DSA rules are to be applied and the jurisprudence of the Court of Justice, everything related to that content, even the Premier Christian article, should be taken down because it actually repeats illegal content. So once the content is deemed illegal, it has to disappear everywhere. And all the references should disappear, the retweets, the likes, the media articles, everything. Now, of course, that's difficult to imagine regarding Päivi, just given the magnitude of the case. But if it is a smaller case or something that doesn't reach that threshold because of this preemptive risk mitigation, right, then that can easily go into the stratosphere. You will never know about it.
So if Päivi is found guilty, then technically speaking, under European Union law, it's illegal content by definition of Finnish criminal law. And then it goes from being a criminal case and a censorship case involving a small Nordic country to potentially 500 million people having that removed.
Absolutely. And just to put this into the wider scheme, why we're speaking so much about extraterritoriality and where our concern lies. So these are not just very vague concerns, because the nature of the DSA is extraterritorial. It has been pushed regarding the criticism of migration, as I mentioned before, regarding the COVID crisis, where there was the concern that specific type of narrative would spill over from one jurisdiction to the other. And the whole concept is to say we need to counter illegal speech from one jurisdiction to the other. So the nature of the DSA is extraterritorial. We're not speaking here about some vague concerns about maybes and perhaps these are going to happen. It's built into its very nature. So the question then is how this is going to operate across the borders and across jurisdictions, because each country has their own definition of illegal content, and each may have their own interpretation and trusted flaggers that would interpret civic discourse. And this is why it is so interesting for us now intellectually to think about that. But from a practical standpoint, the danger is that actually the companies will not go into these intellectual exercises. They will press the delete button because they know they will get a fine. As you have seen last week, an enormous fine of $120 million put on X. For reasons that we're still waiting to get more substantiation from the Commission. The point here being that with massive fines, the companies will not engage into these nuances, and it is a very high probability that they will just push the delete button.
And so we could end up in a situation, it's not an exaggeration perhaps to say that there have been parts of the globe where social media companies have been shut down, where the digital public square, so to speak, has been shut down. We've seen that, for example, at times during elections or elsewhere in places like Turkey, Nigeria, most recently, I think in Brazil. Of course, we know that's what happens with great firewalls of China and North Korea. But I've got this question and one more. So penultimate question. If we're not successful in terms of the list of things that you outlined and trying to break through here, then just again, with your experience and everything that you've learned and seen so far, what do you think is the chances that we do end up in some sort of digital firewalled space where access to information is far greater restricted in the future than it is today?
if we do not manage to repeal the DSA, that is my hope, that we would still have that space open. And here is where we need to get the governments and allies on board to understand this is the only solution right now to get rid of the DSA. And it is not a hypothetical, it is something that I want each of us to engage very deeply in. If that doesn't happen, with the whole regulation that the European Union is putting into place, with all the different pillars that I mentioned, indeed, the risk is that we may get into a very much curated space where there is a race to the bottom regarding specific platforms that may want to get as much information as possible in order to limit speech based on algorithms, on AI. Even the DSA mentions AI. If they're going to use algorithms in order to mitigate risks, then where are we going to end up? The European Commission is right now negotiating a code of conduct on gender-based violence. And why this is important is that if it's going to be integrated into the DSA, even though we do have references to gender-based violence in the DSA, it means that companies will have to filter content based on that. Gender-based violence in the European Parliament has been twisted and misinterpreted as even simple campaigns that are pro-life health centers. And that means the reach of such pro-life centers and pro-life groups may actually decrease due to these filters. So it will be very much a dystopia. I do not want to think too much about this, but it is a reason for real concern.
Thank you. Okay, so my final question picks up really on what you just said in terms of turning a concept like gender-based violence, which everyone agrees is bad, and then through a series of definitional sort of gymnastics, it ends up being something that is not gender-based violence whatsoever, i.e. pro-life. And I think we see similar linguistic gymnastics in regard to the DSA and indeed all of online censorship. And the linguistic gymnastics is essentially because this whole package was sold to us and is sold in all of our countries at the national level through our various similar acts as child safety or protecting children from abuse, child pornography. And so just to finish, help us understand why it goes without saying that we are opposed to all of those things, but that what has been brought in is essentially a big shift from the thing that was sold to the public.
Yeah, you need to have a good goal to have political buy-in. So of course, the European Commission is putting forward child protection and protection of vulnerable groups and what have you, in order to have that political buy-in, because otherwise nobody will say, yes, I agree with a law that is actually going to censor the whole world. It goes without saying. And the Orwellian concept here is that whoever has the power to define the notions is actually going to have the power to define whether you're a law-breaching citizen or law-abiding citizen. So simple terms like gender-based violence should be simple because it involves violence, that it involves some form of definitional difference between men and women, is actually then going to lead into a pro-life assistance. And I'll give you this example in the European Parliament in a committee that was dealing with foreign interference and misinformation from Russia and China. It was a committee that was set up during COVID. And at one point, they had a hearing on gender-based organizations that were promoting so-called violence. And they mentioned a very well-known pro-life group from France. And the criticism was that this group was engaging in misinformation and gender-based violence because they were using ads so that when a person actually puts abortion need help, you get to the pro-life center, to the pro-life helpline, which is something that I know many pro-life groups are doing. And the European Parliament said, no, this is misinformation because it does not relate one specific content with one specific action, and it is violence because it actually puts the woman that is seeking abortion into a very vulnerable place, so it performs violence. But this is such an elastic interpretation, and I would say misinterpretation, right, of the concept, that it gives these institutions the power to corner dissent at any step.
Thank you, Adina, for keeping the space for free speech open in this extremely complex regulatory framework. Thank you for your expertise in really diving into this battle.